Welcome creative friends, Edna Edie here from the Creativity Activist. Today I'm bringing you a little Stamping 101 video at the request from a couple of people who are new to stamping, or they've tried stamping and they say I never get it right. I thought maybe if I share some of my tips and tricks or information about stamps and what they are and how you should use them, that might be helpful. So I'm going to start with what are stamps and what are stamping blocks, and I think that information is really key to getting it right. So a stamp in the artistic world is most commonly seen like this these days, which is a acrylic or photopolymer, like a clear stamp that we use on a block. But way back in the day, they came on wooden blocks, and this one here is a metal plate on there, so it's a really old-fashioned stamp. I collect the vintage type stamps in a really big Lulu vase. And then sometimes they came on these with handles, and in between what now is a rubber stamp on the top, they've got a cork liner for a bit of padding. So two very old vintage stamps in those types, but in the creative world, in the card making and stamping world, they really came to life once companies like Hero Arts started to bring out artistic stamps on wooden blocks, and then they were rubber, so deep etched rubber stamps, quite often in this red colour. And then you can see here there's a foam layer in the middle there, so it allowed you to press down on that stamp and for the inked up stamp image to be impressed onto paper. So when I really started stamping, which is probably about 35 years ago, I did stamp when I was really young. I have a really fun story about the first stamp that I got when I was doing correspondence preschool. But that's a story for another day. But when I really came back to stamping in my late teenage type years, these were the types of stamps that were most common. So a wood mounted rubber stamp with a little foam underneath it, and you ink the stamp up and you pressed it onto the paper. So I still have some of these. I've got a little wall in my creative space with a shelf on it, and I keep some of my much loved traditional stamps. And then we started to move into an era where people wanted less bulk in their stamps, and they started bringing out unmounted stamps. So this is the same rubber stamp on the same type of foam, but it's unmounted, so you can peel off the backing. I generally keep mine on these days, but you can peel it off and mount it to a stamping block, so an acrylic stamping block, and it turns into mimicking the wooden block. It's just with an acrylic block, and then you store these in a packet or in a drawer, and it takes up a lot less space, and you continue to repeat using these acrylic blocks. So that's how the traditional rubber stamp morphed into less commitment from a storage perspective, and you can either put the backing back on or then place these on backing, some sort of storage backing sheets. So they came out in many shapes and forms, and you still see them today. I love Unity stamps. Their quality of stamps is just amazing. And when they first were able to be shipped to Australia, which was about 17 years ago, I certainly bought a lot of them, and I've bought a lot over the years, the Unity Stamp Company. You can still buy those. And then companies like Stampers Anonymous also got on that bandwagon, and certainly they continue to maintain lines like these Tim Holtz collections. So they once again are rubber stamps mounted on foam, and then with this company you also get the backing board to store them on, and you can see here that the stamps are cut so they're ready for use. I keep these in the backing board with that around it, and then you can take them out. I haven't used this one. So you can take it out, use it, and then pop it back in. And I find if you keep that backing so the waste to the manufacturing process on there. When you've got lots of little stamps, it's good to keep that so that you can A, keep them in order, but B, so you don't lose them, because they can lose the backing, the stickiness to the back of them. So from there, we then moved into the more common stamps that we have today, which are clear stamps. So they once again mount. They normally come on a sheet, like an acrylic sheet, and then they peel off, simple, and then you can mount them on a block, just like you do with the rubber stamp, but in this case you can see through them. So once this technology was mastered, rubber stamps that you layer over the top of one another really also came into vogue. But what you get with clear stamps is a point of difference between the types of manufacturing. So these Heidi Swapp stamps and many of the stamps that you see on the market today are what we call photopolymer stamps. So this is a particular production process that involves setting the substance with light, and they become hard enough and also remaining flexible to use as stamps. But what you also do get are cheaper versions of that, and they're known as acrylic stamps. So when someone talks to you about a clear stamp, you should understand whether or not they're talking about an acrylic stamp or a photopolymer stamp. And the difference is in the quality of what the stamp is made out of. And in my opinion, they have different purposes. So if I'm using something for a mixed media application, I think acrylic stamps are fine, because what they quite often do is have a patchy application when you press down on them. And then there are ways of using them to make sure that that patch doesn't work. So when you look at an acrylic stamp, it's a bit cloudier than a photopolymer stamp, and it's a bit stretchier. And in general terms, it's not the quality that you find in a photopolymer stamp. It's different, but it has its applications, and certainly they are much cheaper than a photopolymer stamp. So if you're on the lower end of budget commitment for crafting, maybe this is what you can afford and have as many of as you like. And as long as you're using the right tools to bring them to a traditional stamping application, that will be a-okay. Lots of the companies who license artwork certainly sell them in stationery stores. A lot of their stamps tend to be acrylic stamps. Like this is one of my all-time favorite illustrators, Leanne Ellis, and she, licensed her work to Santoro. And these are acrylic stamps. They're plastic. They have the feel of an acrylic stamp, and they stamp like an acrylic stamp. So it's good to know the difference between the two, because if you're looking for that image to be perfectly stamped, then you're going to need to know how to do that. And I'll talk through that in a little while. So we might just keep that one acrylic stamp out and put these ones to the side just to start making some room. And we might keep these two sizes of rubber stamps out, and then we'll keep this photopolymer stamp out. So I think also one of the really important things to understand with stamps is that they come off a manufacturing process that uses a lot of heat and sometimes a lot of light. And not so much with rubber stamps, but absolutely with photopolymer stamps and with acrylic stamps. You need to treat them once you receive them so that you get the best opportunity for them to stamp well. So if I stamped this stamp here that I have on this block, and I chose an ink and I stamped it today, this is a very juicy new ink pad, and you'll stamp it and there can be imperfections. This is only a very minor imperfection, but it's still an imperfection. And the way to get around that is to make sure that you are treating that stamp And the best way to do that before you even use it is to take what is a coating on the top of the stamp that's left through the manufacturing process, to take that off. So I've just rubbed the ink off with my fingers there, but you would normally use a cleaning product to do that. And I use a mono sand eraser. You can also use a normal everyday eraser. And I just simply take that across the top of that stamp, either whilst it's on its carrier sheet. So if this was new, which I've never used this, I'd normally take the backing off the whole lot, and then I would use this process on the whole sheet. So I'd just start at the top and move along. So if I do that to that one stamp image, I'm not trying to press with enough pressure to take the whole stamp surface off, but if you look really closely here, this is a little bit cloudier than this one over here, and that's because I've taken what is a clear coating off the top of that stamp. So you just continue to do that along the stamps really gently. Maybe if I do half of this one also, you'll get the feel for that. I just go in the one direction. I'm not rubbing really hard. I'm just very simply going over the top of that stamp there. So you may be able to see that one side's a little less smooth than the other. And this is not about rubbing it to a point where you take off or build a grain into the stamp. It's just gently removing the top of or what's left in the manufacturing process. And you can see there when you use a more traditional eraser that just like when you rub out pencil, there's actually shavings that are left there, and that's the top layer. And I would normally come across the top of that after I've done that process, either just with my fingers or with just a wet cloth if you use a stamping chamois, for example. So you'll find now if I stamped that, I'd pretty much get the image that was expected of that particular stamp. And if you've got new stamps and you haven't done that, and then you've used them and been disappointed in them, I'd suggest you go back and do this, because that may return it to the application that you were anticipating from that particular stamp. And also, the amount of ink and the type of ink that you use is really important. I'm going to cover that in another session, but this is a really juicy ink pad, virtually brand new, and you'll always get a lot more ink onto your stamp with the brand new ink pad, and we'll talk about that more in another session. But treating the stamps is something that I've had a lot of success with, and I'd strongly encourage you to invest in a sand eraser. They're only a couple of dollars, or to at least use a normal everyday eraser when you first get your stamps. So that's certainly something I do all the time, and I carry those erasers around in my kit all the time. And then the other thing to understand when you are using unmounted stamps is that the block does make a difference. A lot of the time, if you are inking a small stamp on a really big block, you're going to get pad bleed over here. And sometimes that's okay. If you're an experienced stamper, you know how to make sure you don't rock the paper, for example. But if you messed this up in a really big way, then you've got all of this residue around here that once you get to here, you might be transferring it onto your paper. And that's not something that you want to do. You don't actually want to rock your stamp at all when you stamp it. You want it to be an even press down and an even lift off. That's one of the most important things to remember about a stamping technique. But the other thing that's important to understand when it comes to stamping is the traditional stamp had the rubber, so the image, it has the foam and it has a mounting block. And the reason that that foam is there is to build a cushion so that when you press down on the stamp, you've got a little bit of cushion in between, and it helps with the stamp being pressed into the paper, which might not be always exactly even. So a really good technique to have when you're stamping is to have a foam. If you're using an acrylic stamp on a block, I'm just going to put that one to the side because I'm not going to clean it right now. So sorry, I was going to go through different types of stamping blocks. Let's do that really quickly. So this is an acrylic block. These are acrylic blocks. I recommend having them in various sizes. And then you can also go and buy kits of acrylic blocks like these, which I carry around with me because they're light, and you've got multiple sizes all the way up to really big sizes. So they're a good set of blocks to have. And with these, they've got lines on them. I'm not actually a big fan of having the lines on them, but it does mean that you've got the lines if you're doing sentiments and you want to line it up. So that's something to consider. But let's just keep out one of those blocks, maybe a big one and that medium-sized one. And then we'll talk through their applications. So one thing I really recommend, as I was suggesting before, is you match the stamp to the size of the block. So I wouldn't normally put that little stamp on that size block. I'd think about this size block. You've got less chance of having excess ink and less chance of feeling like you need to rock, because you don't really want to rock. And then some stamps, this is a Unity Stamp Company acrylic block. I loved these when they first came out, and I've never gotten rid of them, but I don't necessarily, they're not the first thing I call for, mainly because I've got other things these days, but they replicated the feel of a wood block with an acrylic block so you could still see through it, which is fun. So in this circumstance, it'd feel like you were still stamping. I haven't cleaned that one yet, so let me just quickly do that, just in case I forget that I haven't done it. So you can still see through that. So you can still see where you're going to be stamping that, but you have the feel of the wood on the side. So that was one of the things that the Unity Stamp Company brought out. And then when you're mounting onto these acrylic blocks, it's exactly the same as mounting onto these. They're just thinner, and I find they're good. I have quite large hands. My fingers are 11 centimeters long, just so you know. But so you need to be able to press around them. It's easy to hold on to these thinner ones, I find, but also these ones have ridges in the side of them. So you kind of got to play around with them until you find things that you love. So let's just take this acrylic stamp here and place it on the block. Use this same really juiced up ink pad and see what sort of an image we're going to get just stamping straight onto there. Not too bad, not too bad. You can see some imperfections down the bottom here, and one way to improve that is to put or to replicate the foam that's on the inside of the stamp that you don't get when you mount your stamp directly to a piece of acrylic. Then you can replicate that in a foam mat, so a stamping mat. Now I've had my stamping mat for decades. Her name is Viola, because I name my stamping tools, and she's one of my favorite friends. And you can get versions of these. This is a 12 by 12. You can get them in a stamping store, any sort of paper crafting store. So just ask for a stamping mat. And then once again, I'm going to ink up this image, and let's see if it is any better the next time we go around with a bit of foam, adding that little bit of pressure that you can push down on, and it's got some give to it. And then you lift that up and you see you get a darker and more thorough application down the bottom there. But the thing to remember with an acrylic stamp is you're never going to get perfect unless you can go back over and stamp it more than one time. So I'll talk through that in a moment. But for example, you get to this stamp here, and we think about where I put those other blocks, please, very much, and thank you. I might just go and get another one because I can't put my eyes on them. And you come to this foam stamp. You can take the underside foam away and stamp that, and you'll still get a reasonable impression. Give it a little bit of pressure, and then you can also do that and have the double foam. And if you don't yet have a foam mat, you might have an old mouse mat from the old days, or you might have a magazine that you could put under it, anything that's going to give you a little bit more. See how much crisper that is than that original one, just by having the extra foam underneath it. So I highly recommend a foam mat. They're very inexpensive, and yeah, one of my all-time, use it all the time tools. And then when you get to needing to stamp something multiple times, and this happens both when you use acrylic stamps, also when you're using photopolymer stamps, even when you're using really good quality rubber stamps, I also recommend investing in a stamp positioning tool. So this is my stamp positioning tool. I bought this way back when the MISTI first came out and wasn't available in Australia, and I've had it ever since. So I don't know how many years ago that was, but at least 10 or 15, maybe even 20 years ago, I can't remember. But it's an arm, like a plastic arm, and then within here it has a piece of foam and then the rulers around the outside. And I always keep scrap paper in here. It's getting a bit messy now, people. So that's all that is, just a bit of scrap paper in case there's any overhang on inking. And it comes with a really strong magnet which holds everything in place. And you can get to a point where you want to have an acrylic stamp and you want to be guaranteed that that stamp is going to be in its full application. So you can take the stamp, so I'm just taking that one we've been using off a block. You know, you want it to be about here, and you're going to collect that on the acrylic arm, and you're going to place the ink on, and you're going to ink it. And when you don't get a full application the first time, you can go back into just the areas you want a better application on, or just re-stamp the whole lot. And you can just use your fingers to press it down, or you can invest in a Baren, which is a printmaking tool. So B-A-R-E-N, a Baren with a felt bottom on it. And it allows you to put that pressure on the stamp, and then you will get a beautiful application of that stamp. And sometimes you'll even, with an acrylic stamp, for example, let's just use that one that we've taken the shine off, pick it up. And because this is a solid stamp, you might not either ink it properly, or you might not get a proper application so that it looks blotchy when you're using it. And you can just continue to go back as many times as you like. And because you've used the magnet over here to keep your paper in place, it's always going to stamp directly on top of where it was, and you can just keep going until you get that application that you're looking for. So in the context of stamps, particularly when you're using an acrylic stamp or a photopolymer stamp, this little tool will be your friend. And when you want to use this tool and you're using a, let's just pop that out, and you're using a, spin that over, that'll be easy, a rubber stamp that has the foam on it. If you take the foam out of the base of the tool, that leaves enough room for you to have a foam stamp that you might use. So we're going to take this massive foam stamp. We're going to clean off here. I did not bring any cleaning tools over to my table, which was a big mistake. Apologies. So we're going to take off those little stamps. We're going to pick up the massive stamp. So there we go. And we're going to take our magnet and pop it somewhere where the stamp's not going to go, and then you're going to get busy with your stamping. So when you have it in here, you don't have to be too pedantic about, did I get the ink all the way over the stamp? You can just use your tools to make sure that that happens. So in here I can see that there's some places that I've missed, so you can just go back in to the places that you've missed, or play it safe and just re-ink the whole lot and come back over here to do your stamping. There you go, and you will always get that beautiful impression. So I hope that helps those of you who may have struggled with what stamps are and what type of block options that you have. And if you try these techniques, you will absolutely get the stamp image that you're hoping for. And if you're using a really juiced up ink pad, it will make it easier for you. And if your ink pad is not very juiced, then just continue to flip and flop on your stamping tool until you get the full image that you like. This is Stamping 101, and I will come back soon and talk about inks and their different applications. I hope this has been helpful to you and that you're doing something creative today. Enjoy!